You know that old joke, I went to a fight and a hockey game broke out? Well, if you didn't, there it is. But sometimes I get the feeling, I know you may have had this feeling too, when you go to a business meeting and a university philosophy lecture breaks out. And I know a lot about the words that get used in these meetings, but if a little bit of knowledge is really harmful, sometimes a lot of bit of knowledge is exceedingly harmful. So today I'm going to talk about one of those words that you probably run into pretty often these days, and it's backstory. And we'll also ask the cards for their philosophy on all of this. I'm John Paul, so you're listening to Life's Potluck Buffet, only on YouTube. All right, let's just get right to it. I'm talking about metadata today, and I'm really talking about meta everything because in the last half century, the proliferation of the importance of metadata and its value, it has been exponential because of the digital and technological revolution. So let's talk meta about meta. And this is the meta episode because I think that might help us think about what's going on with metadata. All right, we're going to have to roll this back to the 4th century BC. So take a little trip back in time with me. This whole idea of metadata ultimately comes from some data. And that's some data that either the philosopher Aristotle, who was from a place not too far from where the founder of Dannon Yogurt was from. I bet Aristotle has never been described, his biography has never been done in that way. That may be a first. I'm just trying to do all firsts in this episode. But that's probably the only first I'll do. So the guy who started Dannon Yogurt was from Thessaloniki originally, and he went to Barcelona and then moved the company to Paris. So that's from a previous episode. But Aristotle's not far. It was from not terribly far away from where the Dannon Yogurt founder was from. And so in Aristotle's philosophy, either Aristotle or one of his students wrote down his basically lecture notes. That's what we think about, what the kind of history of the tradition of Aristotle's texts that you can look at today in English translation or in Greek or in Arabic translation, whatever translation you'd like to look at. So, like all philosophers in ancient times, Aristotle liked to talk a lot about what the Greeks called physika, which we say physics in English, but physics in English is a discipline of science and not, it's different. But nonetheless, it's the same kind of idea. The idea of the physics is that in ancient times in Greek is that it's the natural world in a nutshell, in a sense. So you could see why physics, in terms of the science of physics that we have today, how that relates to it, because it was trying to explain basically a lot of things about the perceived world and universe and so forth. And in general, the Greek thinkers, as well as Roman thinkers later on, tended to think of this stuff as nature. That's what they used words that described it as nature, which is from the Latin version of nature. So that is physics, and that's what kind of all philosophy had that as a kind of groundwork, is this natural philosophy. But there was something that was important to talk about that maybe came, I'll say, before that. And that, for Aristotle, was things like the first principles or principle of everything, and first causes and theology, and all. But all of these things had to do with the natural world. It wasn't like they were outside of the natural world or beyond them. But nonetheless, they got passed down in a kind of jumbled collection of thoughts about the first principle of everything and the first causes of everything. And then you could see where that's going. And the centuries later, maybe one of the heads of the school that descended from Aristotle's thought uh, decided to organize all of Aristotle's writings that were passed down because they were a mess, and organize them into various works. And the kind of like extra that came after physics, they called it in Greek, the metadata title for it was ta meta ta physika, which simply means the stuff that comes after the physics. And it wasn't really meant, apparently, to be a commentary on what you should call that stuff. It wasn't a descriptor. It was simply a structural piece of metadata about Aristotle's writings on the first causes of things and that kind of stuff. This includes the idea of the unmoved mover, some force that isn't itself moved because it is the first thing, but it moves everything else. And then somewhere in the Middle Ages, or even afterwards, scholars who were maybe misreading the metadata thought that it meant that what these things were called were the things that transcend physics. Because that unmoved mover and the first principles, these were things of theological importance for those thinkers. And so it started to become a separate category of stuff that is transcendental, stuff that goes beyond the natural world. But not everybody misinterpreted the metadata that way. Some people, like Thomas Aquinas, the theologian and philosopher, thought that it just meant that this is the stuff that you should learn after you get the physics down pat. Once you figure, so there are many people didn't interpret the metadata as being we should create a name, metaphysics, for what this is, because it doesn't. The word metaphysics is never used in ancient Greek because it wasn't a word. Again, the title was ta, which means the, meta, which means beyond or after, in succession, in this case, ta physika, the natural philosophy stuff that I talk about in the physics. So that divergent interpretation of the metadata became the predominant interpretation. So in the 20th century and the 19th century, when thinkers wanted to start to describe things that were beyond language, that were a step beyond, or in a sense, a step before language, when they wanted to talk about that, they started calling it meta-language. And everything that was that one remove, I guess you could think of it as before rather than after. So in a sense, meta has become the opposite now of what it was originally in describing the metadata as something that came after something else. Now it describes things that come in a sense before or outside in a way that is beyond the data itself. And that beyond makes more sense in terms of the original context. But that is how we started to get words for meta everything, and especially for our purposes, metadata. And I've already talked about the original metadata. For our purposes, the title that scholar who organized all of Aristotle's works gave to the messy collection of lecture notes to organize it into. I mean, that's a perfect example, I think, of a kind of structural metadata. And so that is the whole idea about metadata. Now, what has happened is that in the business context, metadata has become something that could be the target of some sort of, I think the word I would use is extraction or extractive notion. The idea that there's value to be mined in metadata, through metadata, and also through the coordination of these pieces of metadata across organizations or even across the globe between organizations. I think that is why this became so attractive, because in fact, in the same way that human beings in the Middle Ages put great value in the importance of the material that Aristotle was talking about in the jumbled lecture notes that were passed down, the same fundamental value is being sought through our current incarnation of metadata. So keep that in mind and think about that today. And let's ask the cards about what their philosophy is in all of this. So, yellow lemons, blue dumplings, magenta noodles, cards, tell us some things. Okay. It's card 7. Say I am rather than I could be. When you're considering a work identity, make it a goal to say convincingly and calmly to yourself and others, I am X and I do X, rather than I could be X or I could do X. So say one work identity that you would have said I could to, and then now say I am. I guess that's kind of like getting down, hammering down your own metadata about yourself. So put that in a container and use whatever your philosophy is to think about what it means to you. And I'll see you tomorrow on Life's Potluck Buffet. Oh, and if you enjoyed today's episode, it would be awesome if you could hit that subscribe button and make the data for the metadata category of subscribers increase by 1. Thanks. It means a lot to me.